Welcome to level 2. Your goals achieved in 3 easy steps. Okay, so that's a bit of a gimmicky title. And we're going to unpack that a lot as we get further down in this video. But this is going to be an introduction to level 2. It's going to talk about the power of process and how that can be used to help you achieve your goals. That being said, I want to just take a moment and I want to reflect back on what we've already done. So in the last level, you created a interactive Q&A interview to help determine if someone was eligible for DACA. And most of you had no programming experience before that. So you went from never having written a program to writing what I think is a really cool program that could potentially be useful for people. And now you have that skill. And so what I want to do is just acknowledge that and say, great job. But not to rain on anyone's parade. I want to just step back a second and think about the words of Ian Malcolm. All right, so of course, this is the line from Jurassic Park where Malcolm says, you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. And that's an important thing for us to remember as we move forward in any innovation space. And it's the notion that when you're solving problems in a new way, you have to ask, what are going to be the consequences? And you should be doing that even anytime you're trying to solve a problem, but it's particularly incumbent upon us when we're doing something new, because maybe people are not familiar with what those consequences are. And it's incumbent upon those who are bringing something new into the world, I think, to think about the effects of their creations. So that being said, let's go back to our exercise from level 1 and revisit that. We had this DACA flowchart, and to be clear, I'm going to put this in the frame of our imaginary hypothetical. So for our purposes, we went ahead and we threw this disclaimer on there, which hopefully addresses the concerns that we have about putting this out in the real world. But it does provide a moment for us to think about unintended consequences, right? So you all created these things and you published them and you put them on the web. People could find this content from any different number of places. And the fact that people could find this content and not know its history means that you need to make that history very clear up front. Ideally, that the fact that this is a class project and that people should not rely on this. So that's something we've done. But moving on, let's move into, oops, got ahead of myself there. Okay, so I sort of gave that away, but it's not like I'm really doing back and forth where I'm gonna wait for someone to call on you. So let's just go ahead and talk about the most, let's talk about what's the worst that could happen. Now, the first thing that might have come to your mind, even before I accidentally gave the game away, was that users could rely on bad info. Right? So within our hypothetical, this would work such as we build this, people in our firm, we mess something up in our flowchart, people rely on this, and the results that we wanted to get for our clients, the people we're advising, don't work out. So that's sort of the first big one of what's the worst that could happen is we could get it wrong. So obviously we're going to do our best to try to get that substantively, make, in this case, our little DACA bot have all the information it needs. But there are other concerns. So let's just sort of try to think about some of them. And this is what we're going to do over the course of the next several levels, is try to not just think about concerns, but give you frameworks that you can use to evaluate things as you're thinking about whether or not you want to implement them or create them, or thinking about how they might intersect with your clients, assuming that they have some intersection with some technology. And by helping you understand how technology works, in the subsets of technology that we're going to look at here, that's going to hopefully better prepare you for your practice when you go out into the world and you run into it. So the other possibility is that the user could misunderstand. Well, another possibility is that a user could misunderstand the info, right? So we could have gotten everything right, but communicated it poorly, or communicated in a way that was misinterpreted. Now here, this is where audience becomes really important, right? Remember, our internal audience was a set of people at our firm. So we felt comfortable using certain terms of art that we might not have used if it was a different audience. So thinking about your audience is obviously going to be important for making sure that you meet them where they're at so that they're capable to use the tool in a way that is not harmful to them and that is going to maximize its benefit. Obviously, one of the things that may have occurred to you, let's say we were doing this not within the context of an internal knowledge management device that we were doing within our firm, but let's say we wanted to take this and make it public and put it on our website. In much the same way as people had taken the flowcharts that they created around DACA and put them on their websites. Well, it's no content, the content's absolutely not different at all from a flowchart. So in that respect, there should be no different concerns, right? Except there actually might be, because of the way people interact with it and think about that. And in fact, you'll read a little bit about that in our reading below on some of the ways we should start thinking about these sort of legal apps. That being said, the issue that usually comes up here when people are talking about this, they start worrying about issues of unauthorized practice of law and liability issues, right? So like, is a computer program that's helping guide someone through things, even though it's the same as a flowchart that you might have easily classified as legal information, is somehow embodying that in an interactive way, change it such that it's unauthorized practice of law. So this is a discussion we'll have when we get together. So that's something to think about. Also, issues of liability. If someone relies upon this to their detriment, what is their recourse? Okay, is that something that as the author you could protect against simply by having people waive that liability? What are the interplays of that? So these are all things that I want us to think about, and I want you to be thinking about as we go through and we work on our next set of projects. And then there's one that I think is obvious to people, but maybe not its entire extent is obvious, which is the notion of reputational damage, right? If we had done this in our hypothetical and it didn't work out in our firm, it could be that our group is now going to, our name is mud and no one else in the firm will ever want to work on anything we worked on again because it failed them at some time. But there's a larger potential reputational damage for these tools. Because they're new, you have the danger of someone imputing whatever behavior one of these tools has to all of these tools. So you have to really think about the fact if you're going out there and you're creating something you're calling a robot lawyer, and you put it out there and it turns out that not only does it not give people correct advice, but it maybe gives them incorrect advice and ends up hurting them, then that's the sort of thing that can set the entire endeavor of a certain class of technology back as the public feels that they can't comfortably or safely rely upon it. So you have to think about the fact that you're part of a community and that what you do has implications just not for your work, but for the work of others. So it's a trust that you have to carry, and so that's something to think about. This is just a quick introductory video to sort of frame things, and actually the main topic we want to talk about is structuring our work such that we can reach our goals. But it's important for us to talk about what are all the potential consequences of the work we do, because those are going to form the decisions we make around how we reach our goals. And so you're going to have two sets of reading that really sort of help you create frameworks to sort of think about this. And one's going to be an article on substantive legal software quality by Mark Lawrenson and Quentin Steinhaus, who both teach here at Suffolk. Mark as an adjunct and Quentin as a member of our lab. And so you'll read a little bit about them. That'll help flesh that out. That'll be one of the things we'll talk about in our synchronous meeting time at the end of the level. You have, however, already read the first chapter of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And there you have a framework that's presented to you by O'Neill as to these sort of algorithmic tools that have opacity, scale, and harm. She calls it damage. And that when you see these three things together, they make what she calls a weapon of math destruction, which I just think is a wonderful name for a book and well worth the price of admission. So how do you spot these WMDs, and how do you avoid the tools you make from becoming WMDs? This is important as a future practitioner in the law. You might find your clients on the receiving end of some of these WMDs. And you might also find yourself as a technology consumer or someone helping to create technology. You could find yourself helping to create tools and you want to avoid them becoming WMDs. So it's very important that you understand that the things we create do not live in a vacuum and they interact with the world. And we're going to talk a lot about those interactions, and we'll talk about that even a little more in this video. But really what I want to focus on is this notion of opacity, these black boxes, these not knowing how things work, being one of the primary components of WMDs, because the notion that making them transparent could alleviate this sort of classification as a sort of bad thing is incumbent upon people understanding what they see when they look inside the box. And so this class is about helping you have the understanding you need to be able to look inside the box and to ask the questions you need to ask to help disarm these WMDs, or to hopefully prevent them from coming into existence. Or if the harm's already been done, in being able to seek remedies for your clients, right? Or for society in general, whoever you're advocating for. So that's just something I want to flag and have you be thinking about. So a really big question then is, so we've put things in this broader context. We're going to build things. It's very important that we ask, should we build these things? But how do we know what we want to build? And once we decide what we want to build, how do we build something that works well, right? And so here's where processes really can help. So what I want to do is introduce this notion of design thinking. Now, in the reading below, you'll read some more from Margaret Hagan about this in her Design Thinking for Lawyers text on the web, and she'll go through this all in more detail. I want to just give you the sort of gloss of the topic, and we'll use it and put it in context with some other things before we move on. So there are two main things that people often are thinking about when they talk about design thinking or about using design. And we're going to set aside the, there is a tendency to have, well, we'll get there. Right now, when those two things that people tend to think about is they tend to think about the iterative process of design, which is captured here in this graphic in this circular nature, in that you have a set of steps and they repeat the steps over and over again. And then we also think about making design user-centered, which is to say, you're designing something for someone or some population of people. And the important thing is that you put them at the center of your process. This often gets encapsulated in the phrase build with, not for, which is to say you don't assume you know what the solution is to someone's problem, just come in and build the thing for them. You talk to people, you figure out what is their problem, and then you find ways that can help solve that problem. And you make sure they're really solving that user's problem, really meeting their need. And of course, the way to do that is to interact with the people whom you are trying to help. And so a very important first step in design is understanding your user. And that usually means speaking with your user. It means talking with your user, engaging with your user. And you see that encapsulated here under the notion of empathize, right? So you're gonna reach out, you're gonna understand what your users want. And then after you empathize in sort of this structuring here, then you're going to define what the problem is, right? You don't want to start with the tool and say, oh, I have this shiny tool. I know how to do Q&A markup. I'm just going to build a Q&A markup for something. You want to start with the user and their problems, and what problem are you trying to solve? So you might think that I'm trying to solve problem A, and you talk to the user, and then it turns out they have an entirely different problem than what you thought was their problem. Or the thing that you thought was their problem is a problem, but it's such a small problem that it's not really worth working on. And you see this a lot in technology circles where people will come in and they'll say, we're going to have a hackathon, we're going to build a thing, and we're going to fix everything with shiny technology. And there the mistake is starting with the tools, not with the users. So build with, not for, which means involve users in your construction of products. That means make them co-designers with you. Now, there are a lot of hurdles to that, and that can be a difficult process. But at the end of the day, that's often the way. If you want to get something that's actually going to solve someone's problems, you need someone who actually understands the problems. And so actually that becomes part of this iterative process. You empathize with the user, you define what the problem is, and then you come up with some ideas for what might be the solutions. You then build something, a prototype, something you actually get in people's hands, and then you give it to them. And then you have them interact with it. You get their feedback. You see, did that solve their problem? How can you improve it? Were there things that worked really well and you should do more of that? Were there things that didn't work well and you should do less of that? And then you take that and then you can put that out into your final product. But the key thing is your final product is never really a final product because you can always improve it. And this is especially true in software where you actually can improve it and push out those improvements to all of your users immediately. So what that means is then you set up this cycle where you're talking to the users, you're coming up with possible solutions, you're putting them possibilities in front of them, you're getting their feedback, you're incorporating that feedback, and you're creating a product. And you keep with that iteration, that iterative design, that constantly improving. And this has become known as design thinking, and is something that you'll hear a lot about in different circles. It's very big in business right now. There is this movement of design thinking in the law. And although there are people who criticize the movement for sort of being, jargon laden, and is this really anything new? Some of you might recognize in this, well, this seems like the scientific method, right? Some of you might say, well, this seems like iterative project design. And so you have a lot of variants on things like this, like agile project development. You might be familiar with Scrum. There are a lot of different ways of calling these same things. But there's a value in having a structure and following that structure and using it to help you get where you want. And so regardless of what you call it, this structure has proven to be useful when you have a particular need you're trying to meet and solve. There is some criticism about what it takes to be innovations. And of course, there's the old quote attributed to Henry Ford, if you asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And he never would have come up with then you don't invent the car if you ask people what you wanted, because you need to be able to see over that horizon. And there's some merit there, but most of the work we're working on is not trying to be a market defining or redefining creation. We're trying to make things that work for people with real problems using tools that exist. And in that context, this process is extraordinarily useful. A related concept that comes out of design thinking is this notion of minimum viable product, which is really, really applicable to the idea, to the work in software particularly. And this is the notion that since you're going through these iterations, you could be building something and you can release it to users, to real users, not just people who are testing it. And that release is not going to be the final release. So you have to make choices about what's going to be in that release and in future releases. And so one of the ways you could do it is you could say, oh, well, I know exactly what I want the final product to look like. I have this vision of the final product, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build everything step by step to get to that final product. And this often gets described as, building let's say the problem you're trying to solve is getting from point A to point B. And so we're going to build people a car, right? Well, if you just start building a car, then it doesn't actually become useful until you're almost all the way done, right? And that's illustrated here in this this image. And the blog post from which this comes will be part of your reading below. The notion being that if you just build the wheel, right, that's not a car. That doesn't help you get from A to B. A better way to do it is to build functionality such that people could have some use out of your product earlier rather than later, and you can still move there. And so it says you start off with the skateboard, and you move to the scooter, the bike, the motorcycle, and then eventually you get to the car. Now, in physical construction, you can't do this, right? You can't, a skateboard is not actually a subcomponent of a car. But in software, functionality does work this way. So you could have an app or a tool that does one function, and then you can add functions to it. The key thing is that when you're deciding how to work, how to build upon your thing, the key thing to do is to prioritize your features in such a way that when you release them, there's something useful to the end user. And this is known as minimum viable product. So the question is if we're going to work on this for 2 weeks and we're going to be able to do 2 of the things we want to do, what are the first 2 things? And the notion is that you prioritize those things that are actually going to be useful right away. And this allows you to put out a product into the world and then to get real users' feedback on that product as they're using it in the real world. And then you can incorporate that feedback into the next version so that you can build that scooter even better than you would have. So what you're doing is you're taking that iterative process and you're including the production model in it, such that you actually get real user feedback, and it sets up this virtual cycle that allows you to release more and more features to move towards that grand vision you might have had at the beginning. Now, as I said before, there are a lot of different ways to talk about this. In Margaret's work, she talks about it as discover, synthesize, build, test, and evolve, as opposed to emphasize, define, etc. And like I said, there are a lot of different people saying roughly similar things in regards to how you might want to structure development of something, right? And so my general take on it is that some system is better than no system, and that at the end of the day, what you want to do is find a system that works for you. I'm going to mention and introduce you to several systems that are very popular right now and which you will run across when you're out in the world talking with other people, so that you know what they're talking about. Things like design thinking as a philosophy, agile project management. And you will find adherents to some of these processes who are very dogmatic in their adherence, such that you must do things this way, this way, this way, and this way. My general feeling, however, can sort of be summarized by the following. Okay, they're more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. There's a common thread that runs through a lot of this work, regardless of the names you give things. And the main thing you really want to understand is you want to know your audience. That's the same as knowing your user, right? And part of knowing your audience is empathizing with them. You want to understand how they feel about this sort of cross-section of the world that you're going to help engage with them in. And that means understanding their experience. And the best way to understand someone's experience is to ask them about that. And so this goes back to the notion of build with, not for. There's another important component to this that I don't want to have overlooked, which is this notion of, in software, there's a concept that says, something that says that with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, right? So you've had some experience with bugs and debugging in level 1. And you recognize that bugs are these things where it's like you're looking at the screen like it's not working, but you get another set of eyes on it and they can go, oh, you just forgot a space there, or that should have been a semicolon. And the idea encapsulated in the statement is that if enough people look at a problem, they're going to be able to find the solution easily. And implicit in that observation is the fact that people have different perspectives, and it's those different perspectives that allow many eyes and many people to help spot problems and solutions. And so it's not just enough that you're not just involving users because they're closest to the problems. It's because there's a diversity of users. And when you involve multiple people, they're going to see things differently. And they're going to see things differently than you might see it, even if you yourself are a potential user, because you're so deep in the situation. Think back to all the times you've written something and you read over it many, many times, and you read it being one way, but you've actually mistyped something. And it takes someone else who's not as close to it to read it to see that difference. So sometimes the diversity of just our experience, that's a very, very shallow example of that. It can be really powerful. So imagine the benefit of having people with vastly different experiences come to try to talk about solving a problem. And one of the things I really want to make clear, even though I mentioned it in the design process, is that you want to involve, and we did talk about the pushback on this as far as sort of innovation is concerned, but when you're solving a problem, there's really is a benefit to having a diversity of perspectives involved to help come up with different solutions to those problems. And that also means all the things that could go wrong and the future consequences of of what you build, because you might not see them because of where you sit. So involving other people in that process and making it an iterative process when you build something is super important. So what I want to do is I want to say, if we could take all of these different design thinking and sort of management processes that people talk about and product processes, you'll also find there's a lot of overlap here with sort of productivity processes, right? So you might be familiar with systems like getting things done. And then there are some that they sort of overlap and are compliant, right? I mentioned Agile, Scrum, there's Kanban, and a whole bunch of different processes that there are these frameworks that say, hey, if you have a bunch of to-do items, you put them in a column here and you move them over here. And when you're done with this, you check this off and you've done this. Getting things done as a part, that sort of was roughly describing like a Kanban process. Getting things done says, oh, you think of all the steps you want to do, you write them all down, you put them in folders for the days of the week and for the months you're going to do them, and you're offloading your mental energy so that they're all there, and then you can attack them and you'll get everything done. It's great. So you see a lot of overlap in these sort of process improvement suggestions and different ways of doing things that touch not just upon like, here's how we design a good product and do good work, which is really sort of, I think, the focus of design thinking, but also processes around efficiency and getting things done and coordinating teams. And like I said, there are a whole constellation of these things out there, and some of them, are ascendant at one time and get a bunch of adherents, and some of those adherents become very dogmatic. But I thought, what can we do if we sort of distill out a lot of the commonality to a lot of these processes and sort of put them into some guiding principles. So for our class, I've broken it down into 3 simple rules, and so now we finally get to the point of the title of this piece, and I've entitled it "How to Achieve Almost Any Goal in 3 Easy Steps." Right, and of course now I've sort of broken one of my cardinal rules. I put a slide up there with a bunch of text on there, which means that right now I am competing with my slide, and you're all reading the slide as opposed to listening to me. So I'm just going to prattle on for a second until you've done it, or maybe better yet, I should just read along with you. The thing is, I want to read along, and each of these is extraordinarily footnoted, so I want to provide some context. And you might be thinking, well, wait a second, if it's 3 easy rules and they're going to all be extraordinarily footnoted, then they're not really 3 easy rules. And this is the problem that all of these frameworks have, right? Is that you're trying to articulate a larger concept in a short little phrase or a short set of rules. And there are limitations to that, but there's also great power in that, because it provides for a shorthand that you can use to communicate with people who know what you're talking about. So instead of having to take that, oh, well, I think that we should put our users at the center of our design process and get their feedback, because in the end, that's going to make a better product. Instead of saying that, you should just say, well, I think we should apply design thinking here, right? And that comes with a lot of context and history that's going to be important when you want to get a bunch of people together to do something. But that being said, here are, we'll call them coding the law's 3 rules for achieving almost any goal. Okay, there are 3 easy steps. So the conceit we're sort of using here is that all the world's a stage, right? And so I guess it probably isn't going to take off. It needs a cool name, right? We could call this like the Shakespeare method or something, I don't know. Anyhow, so the first rule is craft a believable story set in the present that ends with the goal being achieved, right? Now, so one thing to be clear here is you already have the goal defined, okay, if you're trying to achieve it in these 3 steps. It is not always clear what your goal is or what your goal should be. And that's, again, where I would implore you to involve those people you are trying to help. Because at the end, if you have some goal, presumably you're trying to help some people. Now, if it's a personal goal, then maybe you don't need to involve other people in that, but they also probably could provide you with some perspective. So talking to people just to general good rule, talk to people to figure out what you want. These process, however, here is going to be agnostic as to what the goal is. And so you do want to consider part of your goal should include the consequences of your actions, I would say. And that goes to sort of some of the other reading and the frameworks that you'll be asked to deal with below. But if we're just trying to finish and do something, craft a believable story set in the present that ends with the goal being achieved. So you want to think about, what's the world I want? What's the world as it is? How does one get from here to there? So you write a story out. 2, you break that story into scenes, okay? Which is to say, break it into logical chunks, smaller chunks. And then you have those on team goals. So that's you and the other people who are trying to reach this goal, do their best to act out the first scene, all right? And so we've got this idea of we craft a story, we break it into smaller parts, and then we start working on one of the small sections. I should say, however, in rule 1, that word believable is doing a lot of work. When I say craft a believable story, that means a believable story. If I say I want to create a tool that's going to solve the access to justice crisis in America, that's a great goal. But then the question is, how do I craft a believable story that gets me there? So it's like, okay, well, I think that means I'm going to have to build some tool that is going to allow people to talk directly with the courts and all sorts of stuff. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to get buy-in from the courts? How are you going to actually do the technology? Is technology actually going to solve the problem in the way that you think it's going to solve it? What about those people who don't have access to the technology you're building for? What about, so you get all these questions. And as any good writer would, if you want to tell a good story, you have to tell it in a believable way. So this is, I suppose it's tell a good nonfiction story, or I guess it would kind of be fiction. Well, it's perspective fiction. So you're going to tell the story, but it has to be believable. All right, so we're going to tell a believable story. We're going to break it into smaller scenes. And then what you do is you're acting out this first scene. You're trying to move towards the place you're going. And then a couple things are going to happen. Either reality is going to deviate from the script, right? Not everyone else knows their lines. And you're going to find out that the script wasn't as believable as you thought. Or the scene has ended. You've accomplished what you wanted to in that scene. Or some fixed amount of time has happened. The point is there needs to be some break point at which things are going to stop and you're going to assess. And so it says, after reality deviates from the script, the scene ends or the passage of some fixed amount of time. Repeat these steps until either the goal is met or it becomes impossible to craft a believable story. Right? So what happens is you've broken your story down into sections, you do a section, and then you reassess. And now you tell a new story from where the world is now to where you want the world to be, and you do the next scene. And that means you're going to, sort of rewrite the story a whole bunch of times. That's that iterative process we saw in design thinking. It's the iterative process of the scientific method. It's the feedback system in cybernetic systems. You see this pattern everywhere, given different names. This is just breaking it down to 3 steps. Part of that exercise is to show you, what is in a name. I feel like somehow this has become a very Shakespeare ending, but oh well. It's we are interesting things, people. Oh, what a work of man! How noble in reason, how infinite in form and function, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. Anyhow, okay, this is what happens when we tried to do video lessons. You probably would have gotten the same performance in a real class, because I go off on tangents there as well. This, I think, gives us the framing we want as we move down below and we move into our other levels. We know that the way we're going to achieve the goals we want is by setting a goal, figuring out how we get from A to B, breaking that process into smaller steps, starting with those accessible steps, and moving from there. So what I'll just say is that these are sort of inspired by all the productivity hacks and management advice that you see out there. And when I think you distill them down, I think what you're really talking about is capturing your goals, crafting believable stories, that are going to help guide you to action, testing those stories against reality and refining them over time, right? So with this in mind, you can better evaluate all the sort of advice that's out there. And you can just ask yourself, does this advice help me craft a better story, right? As is the case when you involve more people. Does it help people stick to the script, which is about finding stories that are motivating to individuals, and also helps them remember things, so offloads things from their memory. If the process includes the words innovation and design, it's probably concerned with building better stories, right? That seems to be my experience. If it's talking about productivity or efficiency, we're often talking about helping folks stick to the script, right? You know, so usually by telling them a story that's going to help be a guide to action, right? So you do X, then Y, then Y. So it's about setting up that structure. But either way, at the end of the day, the advice really is, you know, do what works. And so we'll read a little bit more about design thinking below. We'll talk about more about some frameworks, and we'll continue to talk about frameworks for assessing the consequences of what you build. But there you go. There's the trick to easily achieve any of your goals in 3 easy steps. Figure out what the end of the world looks like that you want to be in. Figure out how you get from here to there. Write a story about it. Make sure it's believable. Break it into scenes. Try to act out that first scene. See what happens. If the story has to change, the story has to change. And just keep doing again and again and again. And you'll get there. So that being said, I think you're going to have some fun down below, because we are going to level you up with some more skills. All right. As always, good luck.